I write many, many notes. I have many notebooks. I have notebooks for other notebooks to remind myself things. And I think if everything is prepared and in place and double, triple checked and super organized, then why should there be an issue, or why should there be an anxiety?
If you lead an interesting life, good pictures will happen.
Oh, nice. You might well be my sexiest sounding guest.
Go somewhere you've never been before and take a camera.
We had this gorgeous Mediterranean light just flowing in.
Which Asda were you in?
Dartford.
Very nice.
Your first 10,000 pictures of your worst.
Let's sit down, let's have a cup of tea.
Welcome to the show. Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to this week's episode of the Standout Photography Show with me, Matthew Walker, where as always it is my honour and privilege to sit down with the finest working photographers in the world to unpack their systems, workflows, and find out what enables them to perform consistently at the very top of their profession. Before I introduce our guest today, we have a brand new feature here on the show, Answers for the Audience. So, if you have a question for one of our world-class photographers, you can now call in and we will feature your question in an upcoming episode. We have made this super easy for you to get your questions in. Simply call us on 0207 459 4295. That is 0207 459 4295. Leave a message and your question will feature on an upcoming episode. For now, let me introduce today's guest. My guest today is none other than Julia Fullerton-Batten. That is at Julia_Fullerton-Batten on Instagram and JuliaFullerton-Batten.com on the World Wide Web. And you can find the correct spelling in the show notes. Julia is a worldwide acclaimed and exhibited fine art photographer. Her body of work now encompasses 12 major projects spanning a decade of engagement in the field. The foundation of her success was Teenage Stories in 2005, an evocative narrative of the transition of a teenage girl to womanhood. Her more recent projects consider social issues, frequently covering controversial subject matters. For example, in 2015, Feral Children reenacts 15 reported historical cases of feral children, and we dive into this further throughout the episode. Julia's use of unusual locations, highly creative settings, streetcast models, accented with cinematic lighting are hallmarks of her very distinctive style of photography. Julia has won countless awards for both her commercial and her fine art work, and is a Hasselblad master. My conversation with Julia is hands down one of my favourite to date here on the Standout Photography Show, and I do not say that lightly. I am extremely grateful to Julia for allowing me firstly to speak with her, but to speak long enough that I was able to create yet the second two-part interview here on the show. Part 2 will be released next Friday, the 14th of August 2020. Right now, you are about to listen to episode 1, where Julia and I discuss learning your trade as a freelance photographic assistant rather than a full-time photographic assistant, therefore learning from multiple photographers. Creating lighting diagrams, taking notes, cinematic lighting, building a scene before capturing the image, producing large-scale personal projects, shooting on a tripod versus handheld, and thorough preparation. So without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with the wonderful Julia Fullerton-Batten. Julia Fullerton-Batten, it is a real pleasure to say welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Absolute pleasure. I seem to be saying this with everyone I speak to at the moment, but I think this is the conversation I've been most looking forward to having over the last few weeks. You're in that wonderful position where other people now describe you and your work. As an example, Hasselblad describe you as a worldwide acclaimed and exhibited fine art photographer. ArtNet describe you as a British commercial and fine art photographer. But how do you describe yourself and your work as a photographer?
That's a very good question. I would say that I am a fine art photographer and dabble in the commercial side. I mean, when I started, so I assisted for 5 years for different photographers. And when I stopped assisting, I actually started first shooting advertising campaigns. And it was only after a while that I started shooting my own art projects. So I did start in the advertising world, but what I'm more passionate about is shooting my personal work and my projects, which take anything up to 1 to 3 years. So yeah, I just love shooting my own work. And obviously I like shooting advertising because someone else pays for it. And it's, you normally have a producer, and it's really nice to work with a creative and with another team of people that I may not work with. But yeah, I would say I'm a fine art photographer.
I'm pleased you mentioned both sides of your work, because we're going to come on to talk about them both in more detail later on. Why photography? And I know, as soon as I ask this question, I know how broad it sounds, but why photography for you?
When we were living in America, in Pennsylvania, I remember my dad always having a camera on him. He would always take photographs of us children. He had his own dark room, and he would go off to New York City and come back with these amazing images. Most of them were black and white, some were in color. And he would develop them and print them in his dark room. And I was just fascinated how, you know, you could take something that is a split second, but then you can actually hold it in front of you forever. And I thought that was just incredible. And I borrowed his old Minolta, which he then eventually gave to me, and started taking pictures, but funny enough, not loads and loads. It was only when I knew then around that time that I definitely want to do photography, but I didn't know that you can actually make a living being a photographer.
How old are you at this point?
I was about 10, 11 years old. And I used to photograph my teddies or my friends. And then as I became a teenager, we used to dress up and photograph each other. But I just assumed that everybody else was taking pictures of each other all the time. I mean, people do now with iPhones, but this is when, this is way before iPhones and iPads, and you had to shoot film and get it developed and go take it to the lab and get it printed. And I used to do that on a regular basis. And unfortunately, I don't know where those images are, because it'd be great to have them. Over the years, we've traveled quite a bit, and I've written diaries and taken many pictures, but a lot of them have got lost, which is a shame.
Having gone from that moment where you started to explore taking personal photographs at home, how did you, or what practical steps did you take to start working towards becoming a photographer to make a living from it?
Well, we moved to England, and then I finished my schooling, and we moved to England, and I had to decide what would be my further education, degree or diploma, or what am I going to do? First, I had to finish my own A-levels, and my first choice was to do photography in O and A-levels, and then I carried on, and then I decided that actually instead of doing a degree, I was advised by many photographers that you learn so much working as a photographic assistant, which is what I did I was only going to do it for 2 or 3 years, but I was so busy and enjoyed it so much, and there was so much traveling, that I ended up assisting for 5 years, which actually, looking back on it, it felt like a long time. But when I compare it to assistants now, some of these guys who assist me, they're easily in their late 30s, in their 40s, and it's become a career for some people. Like, this is what happened in a wall in America and still does in New York. It is a proper profession where you can make a good living and have a proper income. I mean, in those days, I didn't get paid very much. I started off having work experience, and then I think my first proper paid job was probably £40 a day, and I was on that for quite a long time. Whereas my assistants now get paid anything between £250 and easily £500 a day, depending on the job.
Assisting has been, without question, one of the constant themes when speaking to great photographers. How did you get those assisting jobs in the first place? Did you write to people? Did you physically go around knocking on doors? How did that work?
I wrote to people. I wrote many, many letters and posted them. And then I followed up by a phone call. And all I need was a little lucky break to assist 2 or 3 photographers who started booking me on a regular basis. And then it was word of mouth. Also, this still does exist, the Association of Photographers in London. And I was a member of the association. It was called AFAP at the time. And I was a member of the AFAP as an assistant. And, they wouldn't just accept anybody. You had to show your portfolio, and you needed to have a good body of work to get your work or get yourself accepted. And therefore photographers can find you online through the AOP, which still exists now. That's sometimes how I find assistance as well these days.
So your 5 years of assisting was with multiple photographers rather than one consistent photographer?
I never assisted any one person full time. I always freelanced, and I did that on purpose because I didn't want to be too influenced by other photographers' work, or I also didn't know at the time what kind of photography I really wanted to do. In those days, I was really passionate about fashion because I thought fashion, and it still is, incredibly creative. I knew I didn't want to do still life or food, but I still assisted still life photographers because you can learn so much. You start with an empty canvas and you build it up by having just one small object, and it's all about the lighting to make it look incredibly beautiful. And that's one thing that was really important to me, was to learn about lighting. And I used to make lighting diagrams. So after each shoot, I used to write like little not diary, but I would make a record of the day after, my way home, who was the client, who was the photographer, what f-stop, what shutter speed did we shoot on, what camera, who was a makeup artist, stylist, and then I did a lighting diagram. And I still have these books because it was something I didn't want to just walk away and just forget about it. I really wanted to concentrate on the day. What have I learned? And also, what have I learned? After a while, I realized that, not every photographer was a great photographer, and I didn't always agree with their lighting. But at the end of the day, I was there to help them, and I could only make suggestions. But at the end of the day, it was up to the photographer how he or she wanted to be the look and feel of the shoot. Also, don't forget, it's a male, well, I don't want to really say it like this, but it used to be very much men's world. There are many more, still now, male advertising photographers. And to be a female assistant 20 odd years ago, I can't remember how many years I haven't counted, probably more, was quite unusual. And I had to really show them that I was technically gained a lot of knowledge, and first and foremost, but also could really carry the heavy gear. And I ended up carrying heavy gear that was, just to prove the point, I ended up carrying more than the guys, just to show them that I could do it. And I was fit for this job, mentally and physically.
You mentioned something interesting then about lighting diagrams. So you mean you would record what the lighting setup was on that day? Is that what you mean?
I would create lighting setups that I drew, where we placed the certain lights, what light shape we used, what setting it was on, and where the camera was, where the model was, and what kind of look and feel it created, what I learned from that day. So that was incredibly important to me. And I learned that from a photographer called Nadav Kandar, who's a really big photographer. And I learned that he always kept lighting diagrams. And I thought that was really interesting. So I thought, I'll start doing lighting diagrams. I mean, they're very raw, and they're not precisely measured. But it was a really good thing to do in case we also had to ever reshoot for whatever reason or create another scene similar. I can go back to the diagrams, weeks or months on and go, okay, this is what we shot at that time. And actually I happened to make a diagram for myself.
I think it's really interesting that you took the decision, and it was a conscious decision, to work as a freelance assistant rather than working full time, because as you say, it's almost like an actor working in rep. You pick up so many different styles and techniques along the way. What was the main, or some of the main takeaways that you learnt in those 5 years?
Oh gosh, I think often you don't realize you're learning something, because sometimes you're just spending all day tidying the studio or creating call sheets, or you're doing post-production and writing checks for the photographer. But all the time you're learning all the time, and I think it's everything. It's how the photographer deals with the client. Those days we had the luxury. Now and then I do on my ad shoots where we had a pre-light day, where we would go into the studio and we could just experiment with lighting. We had all day where that's why I've got so many Polaroids of me, because I'd be standing in, or other assistants would stand in and set up the lights on us. And we would also test film as well. There were so many different kinds of film and cross-processing film. Obviously now these days, most of it is digital, and clients would be very surprised if, a photographer would shoot film. It's more rare for advertising. So those were great days, because you could just have a play, and very often the photographer was so busy he'd go off to meetings, and the assistant and I would just, because normally there was more than one assistant, we would just play with light and create things in the studio. And I love that. I really miss the assistant days, because the burden or the pressure you have on pleasing a client these days with a shoot can be quite enormous, especially if you're dealing with really big budgets and it's all on your shoulder. You often you can't leave the job until it's really completely over or completely finished. Whereas assisting, you can, it's fun and you're experimenting, and it's very sociable because you're always with a big group of people, and you're learning all the time. But to me, it was about lighting. I was always, somehow I realized after a time that you can take stand in front of a really mundane situation, for example, just a building with a couple of people, and you can turn it into something incredibly magical once you start putting really interesting, to me, cinematic lighting on the scene, and it just brings it alive, I think. One thing I always realized was also you could set up lights on an assistant, but once you bring in this beautiful model, it suddenly looks amazing. So I never really wanted to rely on amazing looking people to make the shot look great, because I like working with real people. When I mean real people, I mean people who are not fashion beauty models. They've got interesting look about them, or there's something quirky about them. And therefore, the lighting to me is incredibly important to make it look just that special. And lighting is also about storytelling, where you want your eye, when you're looking at the image, where you want your eye to go on the image, and that's where you put more light, or you make things stand out more. And a lot of people think that I use a lot of post-production, but I use a lot of lighting on my sets, and pools of light, and and I light the set where, a lot of people would follow where the sunlight would come from, but I do most of the time the opposite, to create that odd cross-lighting, to confuse the viewer in a way and give it that more slightly surreal quality to it, which is kind of I would say my signature style of photography in a way. Yeah.
You've mentioned so many wonderful things during that, and I've been furiously scribbling away to follow up with you.
Yeah.
So let me talk firstly, if I may, about actively learning, because I think you are clearly very passionate, and there's a reason you have got to where you've got to today. And I spoke to Tom Stoddart yesterday, who was a wonderful photojournalist, and he said something very similar to you. In the early days, during his time at Fleet Street, he was actively learning, like you've just said then, you were creating lighting diagrams and just going the extra mile. And he said he used to just sit and watch other photographers work so he could learn his craft. Is that something you still do today? Are you constantly learning and actively learning to find new ways to work?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I love listening to other photographers' podcasts or watching their behind the scenes. I mean, it's not very often I get to go on a shoot and just sit there and watch other photographers, because I'm never invited to go on a shoot. But at the same time, I also welcome, I work with a large team of freelance assistants, and I often welcome, don't forget that they're going off assisting other photographers and they're learning new things all the time. So I'm always questioning them, like, come on, have you learned something new? Is there something? I mean, I'm not a gadget person at all. And, I do own my own lights, but I'll always hire them in. But I'm always into creating something different. And I don't have one way of shooting. Like, it drives my assistants mad, because we'll go to a set and I'll frame up my camera on a tripod, and that is my scene. And within that, I'll bring in props and actors and models, or actors, models, same thing, and a whole kind of set. And I create it in front of my eyes. And then obviously it's in the lighting. And because I don't have one way of lighting, I say, let's just backlight it and see how that looks. And sometimes we have to experiment a little bit first before I come to the final image. So there's a lot of playing beforehand and experimenting, which I really enjoy. And it's being open-minded on the shoot, that just some things just don't work. Or maybe if I'm outside, maybe the weather condition was slightly different than I expected. But going back to your question, yeah, I'm always trying to feed my mind in a way of, I have so many photography books, but it's not only about photography, it's also art in general, sculptures, paintings, film. It's constantly anything that's visual that inspires me, and I'm always making notes, or I take screen grabs of things. It might be a film that I've just paused. Sometimes if I'm in front of the TV and I'm watching something, I'll pause it and just snap it on my iPhone. I'm always taking visual references of life around me. It could just be everyday situations, but something could just spark an idea, and then I'm off. Because don't forget, when I create these quite large projects, they're incredibly time consuming, and they involve a lot of energy, time, money, and I produce most of my shoots. So the great thing is, because there's no client, I don't have a deadline, but I'm then very hungry to create the shoot and get it started and keep feeding it. And each project has between 10 and 20 images. And I mean, my last, not the last project, I just did do a project on COVID-19, but the one before on Old Father Thames took me 3 years to complete. And I just find it really exciting. Sorry, I'm blabbling. I'm really going on. I'm going off piste. You have to shut me up and just go, right, that's not what I wanted to ask you.
You're not going, there is no way of going off piste during this conversation. And I'm just fascinated listening to you talk about your work. You mentioned then about your personal projects, that there's no client on site, so there's no deadline to meet. Will you ever set yourself a deadline for a personal project so that you've got a timeline to work with?
I never set myself a deadline, and I never work out beforehand how much the projects may cost me. So these are the things that I just don't do at all. I just start thinking of an idea, and then I start slowly getting into it. I mean, each project's very, very different. My earlier work, I would nearly spend a whole year kind of producing it, thinking of the ideas, and then I would spend a really intense 1 or 2 weeks shooting it, which seems a bit mad now because that puts me under immense pressure because I've put so much energy and time into the thought process. Whereas the Old Father Thames project, purely because of also the logistics, and I think this will be the way I will work from now on, is I would have one idea and then I would produce it and create it, and then I'll have another idea that works for that project and produce and create it. So it was kind of, it's not a stop-start at all, but each individual image speaks for itself. But that very much depends on the project. Like I did a project working with sex workers who are women who work in the sex industry by choice, and they're proud of it, they're well educated, and they're proud of their bodies, and it's what they want to do. And I always found that topic incredibly fascinating. So I created sets, huge sets in a big studio. These sets were rooms that I created for them to reenact their lives in. And I had them designed, and I worked really closely with a set builder. And because of the logistics of me having to hire this huge, enormous studio and having all these different sets in the studio at once, I had to kind of shoot them over 4 days. So that was really intense, 4 days in the studio. And logistically, it just had to work that way. I couldn't keep hiring a studio and bringing in the lights and just shoot one set. While we were shooting one set, another one was being built and erected. And then we'd use a door or a wall from another set that we would re-wallpaper or paint and move it. It was like a jigsaw puzzle that we very carefully thought out beforehand. And so that was the way I produced that. But yeah, each project is incredibly different. But I don't think how long is a project going to take me. But once I know I'm going to shoot the project, I'm so hungry and so incredibly driven that I do spend a lot of time on that project until it is complete. And then my husband says to me, right, well, you finished that one now, so you're going to have 2-3 months off. And I'm like, yeah, sure. And then as soon as I relax, because I don't put myself under pressure, I just go straight into a new, fresh idea. But what's really interesting is when I finished my last project, Old Father Thames, which took 3 years, I was quite exhausted, especially the last one, which was, I'll have to tell you about it, but not right now, the 1814 Frost Fair, but it was 95 people on set. And I ended up directing a small film, and a short film, and I was really exhausted, and I actually didn't shoot or think of a new idea for 2 months. And I thought, I've got absolutely, first time ever in years, I now know how some photographers feel. I have absolutely no idea, no passion right now, and I don't know what to create. And I was really thinking of ideas, and I was quiet with work, and I thought, I've got to do something. And then COVID-19 came, and slowly we had our lockdown, and we were all at home, no one could go out. And I thought, I've got to shoot something on this. I've got to shoot something on this situation we're in. It's not just our families in this situation, not even London, it's not England. I mean, it's the whole world. This has to be recorded. I've got to shoot something. So first I thought I'll just go out on the streets and just photograph people with masks, because that looked so surreal. People wearing masks and wearing gloves, and how bizarre. And it's funny how we've become so used to this now, people wearing masks, and this will now be with us, I think, forever. So images of people wearing masks in the street is going to be the norm. It's not going to be that such an unusual thing. But first I started photographing people just randomly on the street. I would just stop them, say, can I photograph you? Some of them said no, some of them were happy to. And I thought, no, that's not really my style. It felt very reportage. The light wasn't always great. And then I thought, I'm going to photograph people through their windows. And I thought, actually, I already knew then, saw that some photographers were shooting people through the windows. And surely I can't do the same. And I thought, well, fuck it, everything's been shot before, or everybody's doing the same thing. I've just got to do it differently, or hope differently. So I just tested the waters and put a little ad out in my local neighborhood, because we couldn't travel at that time, and we all had to stay incredibly local, and we were only allowed to go out 1 hour a day. It seems so surreal thinking about that now. It's not even that long ago. And slowly and bit by bit, many people came forward and wanted me to photograph them through their windows. And that shoot is something I'm still doing now, or that project. And it's become more and more elaborate in a way that I always brought lighting, and I couldn't bring an assistant at the time. I brought my 12-year-old son, Finn, who I begged him to help me carry the lighting, because I'm so used to working with such a big crew. And I mean, normally I have tons of assistants and loads of lighting, loads of vans, and one van will have props, and Laurie will have the lighting. And it was just me, a camera, a tripod, Finn, and 3-4 lights, some extra clothing, or I might bring a prop like a sun umbrella. That I've got loads and loads of vintage things that I dug out of my storage unit that I just kept in the car. And off we went and photographed. It was always pre-planned with the person in the house, and contact was made via phone or email beforehand. And then I would turn up, and I'd either shout through the window, or I would photograph, or we would talk on the phone, and they would stand inside their house, and I'd be on the other side photographing them. And then, quite a few weeks ago, the shoot would take maybe an hour. Whereas last week, I think I did a shoot, it took 5 hours. So it's become much more elaborate. Whereas I bring in mosquito nets, and I tape that in front of the door, and I attach beetles, and it's just become much more elaborate and much more creative in a way. I'm ranting again.
You're not at all. And I'm pleased that you mentioned your project with sex workers, which is The Act, because it was something I wanted to discuss with you in more detail later on. Let's look at this project, which is Looking Out From Within, because you mentioned then that there are a lot of artists and photographers doing projects on COVID-19, and you didn't want to do the same thing, and you certainly haven't done the same thing by any stretch. And one of the things that struck me straight away looking at yours, some of the images you've created look almost like paintings. They're incredible. So lighting, because I know it's an area of your work that you're very passionate about, it's something I wanted to explore because it's very different to your normal work, as you said. What does your lighting setup look like for this project? And with Finn, obviously.
Well, I couldn't go into their homes, so that was already very tricky. And before I started the idea or the shoot itself, I thought, well, how am I going to do it with my style of photography? Because it's still going to look a bit reportage. But I thought, well, if I shoot it at night or kind of twilight, and it's amazing how each day or kind of each week the time has moved on. It's getting later and later and later. I mean, then it was kind of 7:30, 8 o'clock, and now it's more 10 o'clock because we've already passed the longest day of the year. So that was quite interesting. I would often ask them to switch all the lights on inside that particular room I was shooting in. But because I wasn't only just shooting that particular room and I was showing more of the house, they'd have to switch the light on in all the rooms. And then bit by bit, I would ask them either to move in more lights or individually switch off lights. So that created already a kind of scene that was illuminating out of the room or rooms that I wanted. And then with my lighting, I would then put lights through the windows. Obviously, I had to be very careful with reflections. So it's the angle, how you create the light that you can avoid reflections. And I did a test at home first because I thought it'd be really hard, but actually it was fine because you just angle it a way that you just don't see it. and bring out their faces and their full bodies. And then I bring in other lights of areas I want to light up. For example, a melon on a table, or some foliage outside the vicar's house, or a sun lounger, and pick out a little bit like how I create my pools of light on my bigger shoots. And that would be it. And some of it would have to be slightly longer exposure to let the ambient light become stronger and more intense. Yeah, I think shooting at twilight or evening, nighttime certainly made it look more, gave it more my kind of signature style, I think. Because the ones that I'm looking at them now on my screen, the ones that are shot more during the day are probably a little bit more normal. But then during the day, and when you're not creating all this flashlight, you do get these amazing reflections of foliage and whatever is reflecting in the window, which is also incredibly beautiful. Whereas the flash gets rid of all of that and it goes straight inside the room, which I also really enjoyed. And then I'd bring in other things like fairy lights. So I would always add more to the scene. I would recce the house first, meet the people up front because they're not used to being photographed. I would introduce myself, and we would really pre-plan everything. And often I would hire or buy, mostly buy, because you couldn't hire at that time, buy vintage clothes, or I would try and show a mask or a glove in a different way. For example, I would, on one of the images, instead of the girl wearing gloves, she painted, I got her to paint her hands blue, so it looks like she's wearing gloves, but she's not. And you need to have a double take. So I try and do a little twist with each image. And then people started contacting me, which was really lovely. So, for example, Penelope, who lives on Eel Pie Island, lives on an amazing, interesting houseboat. And I always wanted to photograph a boat, one of these really quirky houseboats. And that was when I got my husband to come along, because we had to access this boat by high tide, because I had to get onto her boat, another lady's boat, and then a third boat. But to get on the third boat, we had to pull the boat towards us so that we can actually climb onto it to then get the view onto Penelope's boat. So I thought I'd better bring my husband rather than 12-year-old Finn. And again, that was shot at twilight, and I got to switch all the lights on. And yeah, I mean, the images, I also do work with retouchers, and, they would, if I needed something slightly more enhanced, or I shot some background plates. For example, if a cat walked onto the set, but it wasn't on the set when I was photographing the boy, I'd ask him maybe to drop the cat in. But I try and shoot as much as I can for real in camera.
Will you, because there's obviously an incredible amount of detail in all of your shots, and you mentioned it then about painting the lady's hand blue. Will you, and you did touch on it earlier, will you find your frame on a tripod and then build the image and add the detail?
Yeah, I mean, you mean with this particular project? Is that?
I guess more just in terms of, yes, with this project, but just in general as a style choice for you. Will you find the frame and then think, right, what can we add? How can we enhance this? How can we make it better?
I always shoot with a camera on a tripod. I never handhold. The camera is always locked off. I never shoot to a card. I always shoot tethered, and usually to the laptop then will be attached to a bigger screen called an ISO. So every single detail in the shot is incredibly important to me. And if it's not meant to be there, then it's taken out. So, and that's how I also did that with my lockdown series, because I would frame up, and often the people were still having dinner, and I'd say, just give me an hour to move a few things around. And, I quite liked, for example, that people had washing hanging outside their house, and I might move that into the shot. Or if the flowers had died, to me, that's something it's like a metaphor of what's happening around us. Or if something's something's in the scene, like it hasn't been touched for a while because people have been inside and they haven't looked after what's happening outside. That's definitely the way I work, is with the camera locked off, and then I create the scene within that frame and slowly bring the people in only when I'm really ready. And we start looking at once we're lit, and we look at the wardrobe and how we can also... I felt everybody had to wear a mask, but there's a different way of showing masks. I mean, you could, for example, put mesh over their mouths or something else, or the mask doesn't have to be on the mouth. It can be just down their chin. But I wanted it to look like it was shot really at this time where we had our COVID-19.
One of the other things that caught my eye when I was doing my homework looking at this project was that you'd said you'd interviewed each person that you'd photographed for the project. And I wondered, firstly, what the reason for interviewing them was, but secondly, is that something that you do often when you're working on a project? Will you interview the people that you are photographing?
I would definitely interview people if they were real people and it was about them. For example, my project with the sex workers, I interviewed them because their stories were incredibly fascinating. And it was interesting to me to find out the individual stories of each person, what they were going through, because everybody was experiencing lockdown and COVID in such a unique, different way. Because you know, we live in a house, we've got a garden, but we were homeschooling, and that was tough and put a lot of pressure on our family. At the same time, we were lucky, and we had glorious weather, and we were able to be outside. Some people were struggling more, and everybody has a different situation. Some people were incredibly lonely, those who live by themselves and they're over 70 years old and they really can't go out. And I just found it really fascinating how everybody experienced lockdown in such a different way. And therefore I asked each individual family or person to ask them the same 5 questions. How COVID-19 affected them, who they're living with, how they feel right now, just to get a feeling of what they're going through and what they're experiencing at this time and moment, and which will be history. I mean, it will be important to our history, and it will be, I think it's important to hear their stories as well, and not just show their images. I nearly regret not also just recording their voices. I was approached by the BBC recently, BBC Radio. I mean, BBC has shown a couple of images, but it was BBC Radio that was really interested in the project, and they asked if I interviewed them, as in recorded them, and I hadn't, and I thought maybe I'd go back, but I feel like that's going backwards. So yeah, I mean, for example, the sex workers, I actually, when I interviewed them, I did actually put a camera on a tripod and film them and record them talking, so you can see them talking. But I guess at the same time, in this situation, many people didn't want to spend longer than an hour or 2 with me, and I didn't want it to turn into a great big project also for them, and for it to be incredibly time consuming. I wanted to get in and get out as quick as I could for their sake. I mean, most of them end up offering me wine, and one of them we end up drinking in that back garden at social distance, of course. I went around the side gate and spending someone's birthday together because they couldn't be with friends and family. But as I was already there, we celebrated it together, and that was really lovely.
It's really interesting. Again, I'm constantly looking for themes with these interviews and threads that are similar, which make all of you as great photographers stand out from the rest. And one of them is that there's always a story. You're always looking to tell a story through an image. Let's take a sidestep, if we may, and just have a quick look at your commercial work, and then we'll come back to your fine art projects. You've worked with some incredible clients and some very high-profile clients: Lavazza, EasyJet, Women's Euros, San Pellegrino, British Gas, to name a few. And you mentioned it earlier that there can be a lot of pressure sometimes on these shoots, particularly the larger the scale. You know, there's a lot of money at stake, there's deadlines to meet, there seems to be a million and one people to please. Do you ever personally feel that pressure? And if so, what techniques have you developed over the years that allow you to use it positively?
First of all, I'm never one of these photographers who has sleepless nights. So once I put my head on the pillow, that's it, I'm out. And also I can sleep wherever I go, which is incredibly handy. So when you're traveling, or, you know, a night before a big shoot, I think something that can disrupt people often is not being able to sleep well. I exercise a lot, and I do a lot of yoga. I wouldn't say I meditate, but I think with yoga you concentrate a lot on your breathing techniques, and that in a way is meditative, I would say. I don't sit and meditate. I don't completely switch off. I somehow, I don't get nervous, and I don't have anxieties. For me, preparation is key. I write many, many notes. I have many notebooks. I have notebooks for other notebooks to remind myself things. And I think if everything is prepared and in place and double, triple checked and super organized, then why should there be an issue, or why should there be an anxiety? And as long as people want to work with me and they like my style of photography. And don't forget, I'm so used to producing my own shoots now that I nearly double, triple check other producers when they come on board, as if I'm producing it myself. So I'm not, when it comes to the preparation and the setting up, I'm probably not one of the most relaxed people to work with, in a way that I really do turn over each pebble and make sure everything is checked. I mean, I'm never left without a camera, for example, whereas I remember when I assisted once, we left this woman's house, and, you know, after an hour's drive, I said to her, that bag I packed, that has got your camera in it, hasn't it? And she was like, whoops. I don't know who was to blame. I took the blame in the end. But yeah, everything is really, really organized. But what I've realized is I do also rely on an amazing group of people, team of people around me. And if one of them were not to turn up, it would certainly have an impact, a great big impact on our shoot. I mean, for example, if my main first assistant, for some reason, overslept or had food poisoning, whatever, and went to my lockup or went to the higher place, you know, like direct lighting to hire the gear, if he, who's got the van, for some reason can't be there on the shoot, we're in deep shit. So I'm not doing it all myself. I'm relying on people that have to be there on the shoot. But again, I will, as soon as I get up, I'm texting people, I'm ringing them, especially the most important people, and checking they're awake and they're on the way, and everything is okay. So touch wood, we've been incredibly lucky. On the shoot itself, I do admire photographers who've got, you know, sometimes I've got a friend who's she's a fashion photographer, and she comes with a couple of lights. And when I see her behind the scenes, they're having a jolly good time. You know, the music is loud, they're all dancing. She's got a lot of time to sit and chat to people. And that certainly doesn't happen on my shoots. Because of my quite large setups and a lot of lighting, there's so much for me to do on the shoot that I'm always, now we do a lot of behind the scenes, I'm always frowning or looking quite stern or kind of really concentrating, and it's quite exhausting at the end of the day. I can really feel, you know, I need to drop my shoulders again and get into that yoga mode of, you know, pull your shoulders back, because the shoots are incredibly intense, and that's my personal shoots or the advertising shoots. But I try not to show that in front of the client, and I do keep calm on the days. But there is definitely, there's pressure on the day for sure.
I guess you mentioned something really interesting there. Because you work on a large scale for your personal projects, you transcend beyond the photographer to being a producer as well, which, as you mentioned then, has helped you and aided you during your commercial projects as well. I love that you said you will producer's work. I really enjoyed that. When you're on a shoot, whether it's personal or commercial, what will you delegate to your assistants? And I guess maybe more importantly, what will you never delegate to your assistants? And I don't necessarily mean as you wouldn't delegate it because you don't trust them. I mean, are there certain things that you like to do?
Good question. I like my assistant to be involved. So once this is personal or commissions, I would very often bring in my first assistant on the recce day so that we can go around the room or the location, and I would then brief him or discuss with him how we light the scene or the set. And we would do a lighting list, or often I would have already pre-prepared a lighting list. I would get him to double check it to make sure I haven't left anything out. I am a bit of a control freak, as you may have noticed, so I do a lot myself, but I also have I do have the time to do it, so I do it. And then he will double check it, or we'll work on it together. And it's little things that you can just, like extension leads. Do you have enough extension leads? And where the PowerPoint coming from? Do we need a generator? Have we got the tripod head? There's so much that can go wrong on a photographic shoot. You won't believe it. Have we packed the gas cylinders for the smoke machine? I use a smoke machine to create a misty effect, not to make it look smoky, but to create a hazy look. That's really important on some of my images. And once the assistant didn't pack the smoke things, so I will also write a list of things that have to be packed out of my storage unit, and then a separate list of what they need to collect from the lighting company, and that will have to be checked off, because at the end of the day there has to be some trust there. I don't go in the van. I often arrive on set separately. But what's great is when I've got my first assistant who's been fully briefed and who I completely trust, and most of them have, believe me, they know what they're doing. They've assisted, these days, some of these guys have assisted 10, 15 years. I mean, they are photographers in their own rights, and I'm privileged and very lucky that they come with me on set, that I can then concentrate on other things and really, speak to the actor or model and brief them, talk about what we're trying to achieve, what look and feel I'm after, what emotion I'm trying to create. Because don't forget, it's not just the technical side. It's very much the kind of, what are we trying to achieve? Is it for a pharmaceutical company? Is it for cancer? Do they need to have a certain, what's their emotion? And that's really important for that to come across in the image. One thing I tend not to do is go on castings, because I find some photographers do go on castings, but I find when there is a casting director and they're viewing 100 people, I can tell by seeing the images, and often I get them to do little videos. When seeing them on my screen from my office, I can tell which ones work and which don't. And often we'll do a fitting where I will meet them again, and we might cast just the 3 or 4 people that we think will be really suitable. So we've narrowed it right down. And that's when I will meet them, because I find if I go to every casting, it can be incredibly time consuming. I'm just sitting there. Well, either I'm directing it myself, which I don't really like to do, because it's you're saying the same thing to each actor. But yeah, what was your original question? Have I answered it?
you have. I was asking what will you delegate and what won't you delegate on a shoot? So what will I delegate? So with my assistants, I'll delegate the lighting, the setup. What I won't delegate to my assistant is, I won't discuss with them what the wardrobe and props are, but I will delegate for them to go to that prop hire and collect this and that prop, and that's the order number. So I will give them the list of things to collect, but that's something that I or my stylist will organise at our end. They won't be involved with discussions of hair and makeup. The assistant is never involved with the pre-production meeting. It's not important that they're there and it looks like I've come along with another partner. I don't need that. I can control that myself, and I often turn up with my agent who looks after that side. Post-production, they don't get involved with at all. So the freelance assistants only get involved
as soon as I hear about a job that or when I do my own shoot, I try and pencil them because they're incredibly busy. So I try and book them in the diary. And when it comes to the shoot, as I say, my first assistant will come in a day earlier, and I'll get them involved, but not with every minute little detail. They're just more on the lighting and the technical and the slightly digital part. And the rest, it doesn't really matter for them.
You've touched on it a couple of times, and you've mentioned about hiring in equipment. When you're on a larger shoot, what's the ratio of kit that you will bring versus what you will hire?
I only have really old gear now, so I tend to just that ends up being a lot of the time that's backup gear, and that often will just sit in a lorry and possibly not use. Or if we're low on nights, then I know I've got more in case I need it. So I tend to hire most of it for sure.
And is that because you like to tailor the lighting for each shoot and it gives you more options? Is that why you decide to go down the hire route?
I've stopped buying equipment a long time ago because I realized that the more equipment you buy, the more storage you need. And these days you can get better quality, the most up-to-date flash packs and heads. And that stuff is bloody expensive. And I hire it when and if I need it. And the equipment companies have it all. And everything is pretty much, living in central London, everything's on our doorstep. So it wouldn't make sense for me to have tons of this gear. It just wouldn't make sense. It's all insured, and we just hire it when and if we need it. It just gets tricky when very often if we're shooting back to back, let's say for a whole week, where the equipment goes at the end of the day before the next day. But these are just logistical things that we need to work out. But there's always ways around it, like hiring a bigger storage unit or driving a lorry or a van into a special place that has CCTV camera. As long as it's all insured, wherever it is, it's completely fine. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Again, there's so many things I'd like to explore, yoga, meditation being two of them, and also making notes. I thought it was really interesting because I do something very similar. I use Evernote, and if I'm working, not even necessarily in photography, just in general, I have a checkbox, even the smallest detail, to check that I have it with me and that it's left at the end of the day as well. That was part one of my conversation with the wonderful Julia Fullerton-Batten. A huge thank you once again to Julia, and I'm delighted to say that part two will be available next Friday, the 14th of August 2020. Here is a sneak preview.
My shoots or my projects are incredibly time-consuming because they're all quite elaborate and just take a long time to, first of all, research, but also to put it all together. I mean, the shoot itself takes a day, but it's just creating the scene to make it look... I mean, I'm not trying to make it look like I've just turned up and I've snapped it. It is meant to look, and I'm not trying to pretend, it is meant to be a recreation of a slightly historical story that I've read or I've heard about, and it's how I see it visually in my eyes. I mean, you give 10 different photographers the same brief, you'll come out with completely 10 different completely end results, but that's just the way I see it and how I create it, the look and feel.
If you enjoyed my conversation with Julia as much as I enjoyed speaking with her, please support the show with your words, not your wallets. This show is completely free, and that's how it will always remain. So your kind reviews really do make a huge difference in securing the very finest photographers in the world here on the Standout Photography Show. It takes less than 30 seconds on Apple Podcasts or wherever you are listening now to leave a review, but it does make a huge difference. So once again, please support the show with kind words, not lighter wallets. For now, thank you as always for joining me. I've been Matthew Walker, she has been Julia Fullerton-Batten, and you have been sensational. Until next time, take care.